The boy's heart raced as the ice shattered beneath him. Cold water rushed in, pulling him under. Just as hope seemed lost, a hero appeared. Someone unexpected, rushing to save him. The winter morning was crisp and bright, the sky a clear blue, and the ground covered in a soft blanket of snow. The boy, around 12 years old, stood at the edge of the frozen lake, his breath forming little clouds in the chilly air. His cheeks were rosy from the cold, his eyes sparkling with excitement. He had been looking forward to this day for weeks. The first day the lake had frozen over thick enough to walk on. He'd come here with a couple of friends earlier, but they'd headed back home when the sun began to dip. Now, alone, he felt free. The world around him was vast and peaceful, filled only with the crunch of his boots against the snow. Every step he took on the ice felt like an adventure. He couldn't wait to explore every inch of it, to feel the rush of sliding across the surface, just like he had seen in the movies. For a moment, everything seemed perfect. The cold, the snow, the stillness. It was as if nothing could go wrong. But little did he know, this serene day would take an unexpected turn, one that would change everything. The boy took another cautious step, the ice beneath his boots creaking with each movement. He glanced around, his breath visible in the frigid air, the world stretching out before him, still and quiet. The snow-covered trees on the far edge of the lake stood like silent sentinels, their branches heavy with frost. The boy smiled to himself, thrilled by the adventure, and took another step forward, feeling the slick surface of the ice beneath him. He had done this before, back when he was younger, but today it felt different. There was something more thrilling about being alone, the only one on this vast frozen expanse. The noise from his boots echoed softly, a sharp contrast to the stillness around him. With each step, the crackling sound underfoot grew louder, more ominous. It wasn't just the sound of his footsteps anymore. It was something deeper, like the lake itself was groaning under the weight of his body. He paused, listening, but it seemed like nothing more than the natural sounds of the ice settling. And then, without warning, a loud crack shattered the silence. His heart skipped a beat. His eyes widened in disbelief as the ground beneath him splintered. The ice split apart, and before he could react, his legs dropped through the hole. He screamed as the freezing water rushed up around him, swallowing him whole. Panic surged through him as he struggled, his hands frantically reaching for anything to hold on to. The cold was unbearable, a biting shock that stole the air from his lungs. The lake gripped him with terrifying force, pulling him down deeper. The boy's heart raced as his body fought the instinct to freeze. His chest tightened and he gasped for breath, but all he inhaled was icy water. His arms flailed helplessly, and his legs kicked frantically, trying to find anything to grab onto, but the ice above was too far out of reach. The lake was dark, swallowing him, pulling him deeper with every desperate attempt to stay afloat. His mind spun. "I can't breathe," he thought, his panic heightening. He tried to scream, but the freezing water filled his mouth, choking him. His limbs grew heavier by the second, the cold sinking deeper into his skin, into his bones. The sharp, bitter sting of the water seemed to freeze his very thoughts. His vision blurred as he struggled to stay above the surface, each second feeling like an eternity. His heart pounded in his chest. He felt the weight of the cold water dragging him down, felt his strength slipping away. "This is it," he thought, as the icy grip tightened around him. "I'm not gonna make it." Fear and helplessness rushed through him like a tidal wave, and the sound of his panicked breaths was the only thing that filled his ears. But in the depths of that terrifying moment, when hope seemed lost, something shifted in the shadows of the lake's icy expanse. He couldn't see it yet, but it was coming, a flicker of movement in the distance, the faintest sound of something or someone drawing near. The cold water closed around him like a vice, dragging him deeper. His arms felt like lead as he fought to keep himself afloat, but every stroke was slower, more sluggish. His fingers were numb, unresponsive. He couldn't feel his feet anymore, and the icy grip of the water was seeping into his chest, freezing the very breath in his lungs. His heart was racing, but it felt as if it were slowing down with every panicked heartbeat. The shock of the water was too much. His vision blurred at the edges, the cold fogging everything around him. He kicked desperately, hoping to find something solid, anything to hold on to, but the water only pulled him further into its depths. His body shook uncontrollably, but not from the cold alone. It was fear, raw, unfiltered fear, the kind that made his stomach tighten and his hands tremble. He tried to scream for help, but all that came out was a choked gasp, a desperate splutter as the icy water filled his mouth. No one could hear him. The lake was vast, empty, and the wind howled like an invisible beast, swallowing his cries before they even left his lips. He tried to stay calm, to remember what he was supposed to do, but the fear was taking over. The freezing water made everything seem distant, muffled, as if he were sinking into a nightmare. Each breath he took was ragged, sharp, but it wasn't enough. His lungs burned for air, and his arms felt weaker with each desperate stroke. Every second felt like a lifetime, and the lake, vast and unrelenting, was closing in on him. Was this it? Was this how it all ended? He tried to hold on to hope, but the thought of never seeing his family again, never feeling warmth, felt like a cold reality he couldn't escape. His limbs were giving out. His strength was draining. He was sinking deeper, and with every passing moment, it seemed as though the cold was slowly, inexorably, pulling him toward the darkness. But then, in the midst of his terror, a flicker of movement in the distance caught his eye. A shape, a figure perhaps. He blinked, barely able to focus, but there was something there, something moving toward him. Could it be? Was help on the way? Just when the boy thought he couldn't fight anymore, when the icy grip of the water had nearly consumed him, he saw it. A blur of movement. A figure. Was it real, or was his mind playing tricks on him in the freezing darkness? His heart skipped a beat, and despite the cold, despite the panic clawing at his chest, he focused all his remaining energy on that flicker of hope. Through the blur of water and his own labored breathing, he saw her. A dog, a large, sturdy creature, her fur thick and matted with snow. Her eyes were locked on him, her body low, moving swiftly across the ice toward him. Marta, the shepherd, was charging toward him without hesitation, her paws pounding the icy ground as if she knew exactly what to do. She wasn't just running, she was determined. The boy's heart swelled with a sudden sense of relief, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel until now. Marta reached the edge of the water, her tail wagging furiously as she stopped just a few feet away from the boy, her eyes wide with concern. She barked loudly, as if urging him to hold on. The boy's fingers barely responded, his body still in shock, but he managed to raise his hand, reaching out as if to grab her. And then, without hesitation, Marta lunged. She didn't pause to think or hesitate. With a strength and instinct driven by love and loyalty, she dove forward, her powerful jaws gripping the boy's jacket. His heart pounded as the cold water pulled at him. But Marta wasn't letting go. Her grip was firm, her body braced against the weight of the water as she began to pull. The boy's head was spinning, his limbs like lead, but in that moment he could feel the warmth of Marta's strength, her unwavering determination. She wasn't just pulling him out of the water, she was pulling him back to life. "Hang on!" He wanted to shout, but his voice was barely a whisper. The cold water had drained all his energy, and now all he could do was hang on to her, trusting that this incredible animal would not let him go. Marta's paws slid over the ice as she pulled him inch by inch, her muscles straining with the effort. She kept moving, no matter how hard it got, as if she understood the urgency in a way only a loyal animal could. Finally, with one last powerful tug, the boy's head broke free of the water. He gasped, taking in deep, frigid breaths, the sharp sting of the air hitting his lungs like fire. His body shook violently, but Marta didn't stop. She dragged him further from the water's edge, pulling him toward the solid ground. The boy collapsed onto the ice, coughing and sputtering, his teeth chattering uncontrollably, but he was alive. He could breathe. And more than that, he felt the warmth of gratitude flooding through him. He looked up at Marta, who stood beside him, her body heaving with exertion, but her eyes filled with an almost palpable relief. Her fur was damp and matted, but she was still there, standing tall beside him like a hero. "Marta?" he gasped, his voice shaking with emotion. The dog looked down at him, her tail wagging gently as if she knew exactly what had just happened. Her eyes softened with a quiet pride, as if she was content in the knowledge that she had saved him. The boy's fingers reached out, trembling, to stroke her fur, and as he did, he realized how close he had come to losing it all. He had been just moments away from being swallowed by the lake, and yet here he was, sitting on the ice, alive, thanks to this incredible dog who had stepped in without a second thought. Marta's work wasn't done. She stood close to him, nudging his shoulder with her snout as if urging him to get up, to keep moving. The boy wiped the tears from his face, his body shaking not just from the cold, but from the overwhelming gratitude he felt. "Thank you," he whispered, knowing she would never fully understand just how much those words meant. He had been rescued, and in that moment, the boy knew that he had found a friend for life, someone who would always be there when he needed her most. The boy's body trembled violently as he lay there on the solid ground, his clothes soaked and freezing, but for the first time in what felt like forever, he could breathe. The air, sharp and biting, felt warmer now, and the ache in his chest slowly began to ease. His heartbeat, once erratic and frantic, started to settle into a more steady rhythm. He felt the tremors of panic and cold slowly fade, replaced by a profound sense of relief. Marta sat beside him, her eyes soft and steady, her fur still damp from the lake but her body warm. She nuzzled him gently, her wet nose pressing against his cheek as if to reassure him, to tell him that everything was going to be okay. The boy instinctively wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close, grateful for her warmth. He had been so close to losing everything, and yet here he was, alive, safe, thanks to her. "Thank you," he whispered hoarsely, his voice trembling with both emotion and exhaustion. His words were barely audible, but they carried all the gratitude he could muster. "You saved me." Marta's ears perked up at the sound of his voice, and she licked his face affectionately. Her eyes, those warm, loyal eyes, seemed to shine with a quiet pride, as if she knew how important her actions had been. There was no need for grand gestures or words from her. She had already done everything that needed to be done. She had given him a second chance at life. The boy sat up, his body still shaking, but his heart lighter than it had been just moments ago. He could feel the warmth of the sun starting to pierce through the clouds, offering a glimmer of hope in the aftermath of his ordeal. The world around him, once cold and unfeeling, now seemed a little brighter. The ice on the lake no longer looked as menacing. Marta sat next to him, her tail gently wagging, watching him with an expression that said she wasn't going anywhere. They sat together in the quiet aftermath, just the two of them against the world. The boy leaned his head back, gazing up at the sky. He thought about how, in the blink of an eye, everything had changed, from the excitement of exploring the frozen lake to the sheer terror of almost losing his life. But most of all, he thought about Marta, how she had never hesitated, how she had acted purely out of loyalty and love, without thinking of herself for even a second. He realized then that friendship wasn't just about playing together or spending time with someone. It was about standing by each other when it mattered most, when everything else felt like it might crumble. Marta had been his protector, his hero, in a way he could never have imagined. "I'll never forget what you did for me," the boy said, his voice steady now, filled with the deep sincerity of someone who understood the true value of friendship. Marta simply looked at him with those wise, unspoken eyes, and in that moment, he knew they would always be together. Through any adventure, any trial, any challenge, their bond, formed in the most unlikely of circumstances, was unbreakable. The boy smiled faintly, the last of his shivers fading as the warmth of the sun bathed them both. He was safe. And more than that, he had learned what true loyalty and love meant, all because of the incredible dog by his side. The boy's body still trembled from the cold, but his mind was slowly clearing, his thoughts focused now on the warmth that began to surround him. As he sat on the solid ground, Marta, the dog, stayed by his side, her soft fur brushing against him as she lay close. He could feel the heat radiating from her, and despite the chill in the air, a sense of safety began to settle in. His heart, which had been racing in panic just moments ago, now beat with a steady rhythm. His breath, sharp and shallow just minutes before, began to slow. The biting cold of the water still clung to him. But as he huddled next to Marta, he could feel the warmth of the moment seeping into his bones. The reality of what had just happened began to settle over him, and with it came the rush of relief that he was still here. He looked down at Marta, her loyal eyes meeting his. Her tail, still damp from the lake, wagged slowly, a comforting gesture, as though she knew exactly what he needed. He couldn't stop staring at her, overwhelmed by a feeling of gratitude he could barely put into words. "You saved me," he whispered hoarsely, his voice trembling, though no longer from the cold. He had never known a moment like this before, one where the difference between life and death had rested in the paws of a dog. Marta's eyes softened, and she licked his hand gently, her movements calm and assured. She didn't need any praise. She was simply content to be there with him, her presence reassuring, her loyalty unwavering. As the boy sat, the weight of the moment finally hit him. He had been so close to losing everything, to disappearing beneath the ice, to never seeing his family, his friends, or even the sun again. But now, here he was, alive and well, thanks to this remarkable dog. A quiet smile spread across his face as he looked at her. "Thank you, Marta. I'll never forget this. I owe you my life." Marta responded with a soft woof, as though acknowledging his gratitude. She didn't need words. She had already shown him everything he needed to know. In that moment, the bond between them was unbreakable, forged not by time or words, but by a singular act of pure loyalty and love. The boy leaned against her, closing his eyes for a moment. The warmth of the sun finally broke through the clouds, casting a golden glow across the lake and the surrounding trees. The world seemed a little brighter now, a little more full of possibilities. For the boy, this was no longer just the end of a near-death experience. It was the beginning of a lifelong friendship, one that would continue, no matter what challenges lay ahead. With Marta by his side, he knew there was no obstacle they couldn't face together. The boy sat there, feeling the warmth of the sun on his skin and the steady rhythm of Marta's breathing beside him. He had been through something he would never forget, something that had changed him in ways he couldn't quite explain. But as he looked down at his faithful rescuer, a sense of peace washed over him. He was alive, and he was not alone. The bond between them was something deeper than words could describe. Marta had saved him, not just from the cold, but from a fear of being powerless, from the darkness that had threatened to overtake him. Now, he knew what true loyalty meant. It was more than just a feeling. It was action, it was sacrifice, and it was love. As he stood up, his hand gently resting on Marta's head, he made a silent promise to always be there for others, just as she had been there for him. Life had a way of throwing challenges, but now he felt ready. With Marta by his side, he was never truly alone. Together, they would face anything the world had to offer as true friends, always.